So thank you very much for being here today for this lecture from Professor Nikos Papadakis. Let me just tell you a few words about our lecturer here. Professor Nikos Papadakis, he's a professor and former head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Crete. He's a distinguished visiting professor at the Academy of Globalization and Education Policy of the Zhengzhou University in China. He's a member of the scientific board of the National Center of Public Administration and Local Government of Greece. He's director of the Center for Training and Lifelong Learning of the University of Crete. He's honorary president of the Hellenic Association of Political Scientists and a member of our standing group. And he was, until recently, deputy director of the University of Crete Research Center for the Humanities, the Social and Education Sciences. He is the director of the Center for Political Research and Documentation at the Department of Political Science. He was an international expert at the ETF, the Skills and Vet Governance Project, and he was a special advisor to the European Commission the years 2011 to 2013, and he has participated at the European Commission Education and Training Coordination Group, as well as the advisory board of the UNDP RCPAR, Regional Center for Public Administration Reform, and the European Commission SKIP, the studying group on indicators and benchmarks. He is a visiting professor at the Zhengzhou University in China, and he participates as an external evaluation in the external evaluation committees of the Agency for Quality Assurance and Accreditation in Higher Education of the Republic of Cyprus. He also cooperates with the ESRC Funded Lakes Research Center of the UCL, while he's currently a scientific associate of the Hellenic Agency for Local Development and Local Government. He has about 179 publications in Greek, English, French, and Chinese, including journal articles, conference proceedings, and book chapters. He is the author of 12 books in Greek and English, while he has edited 11 books. He has participated, or he is currently participating in 49 mainly research projects in Greece and abroad, either as a team leader or as a research expert. So we would like to thank Professor Nikos Papadakis for this lecture. And Professor Nikos Papadakis, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Allow me to thank the steering committee of the ECPR Political Culture Standing Group, and in particular to thank Dr. Stylianos Zagorakis, Professor Martin Newman, Professor Martin Mauk for your kind and honorable invitation. I'm always honored to participate in ECPR's activities, and I'm further honored to participate in this very innovative series of lectures concerning political culture. I intend to focus, and I will try to be brief, even though I have prepared a quite extended PowerPoint presentation. However, I prepare it in order to be at your disposal and at the members of the standing group disposal. I will try to be brief. I will focus on the issue of precarious work, which is rising all across the globe, including Europe and Greece. I'll emphasize Greece, and my main focus will be on the impact of precarious work in the key determinants of young people's life course, including issues related to public trust and political behavior. Give me just a second to moderate it. Allow me to skip the definitional issues and the theoretical part And just to refer that the term precarious work conceptually means a form of work which is characterized by uncertainty, insecurity, and instability, and in which employees have limited social benefits and protection and an increased risk of losing their job. According to the ILO, precarious work and specifically precarious forms of employment can be categorized into two main clusters based on the type of contractual arrangements, the duration of the contract characterized by limitations, for example, seasonal work, temporary work, etc., and the term's nature of the employment relationship, for example, triangular and discussed employment relationships. And I'm skipping that part. Just to mention that the so-called megatrends related mainly to digital economy and with other transformations within the globalized economic arena, digitalization, demographic and social challenges, and climate changes, somehow formulate a new landscape. These megatrends had a clear impact on the structure of economy and labor market, industrial relations, systems, and business models, having in turn direct impact on work relations, forms of employment, and contract types, and consequently on social welfare systems in Europe. In terms of the state of play concerning precarious work, during the decade 2008-2018, the rates of part-time and part-time employment in all its types, permanent, fixed-term, self-employed, increased in most EU countries. The gender gap regarding part-time workers was very large during the last decade, remarkably large. In all the European countries, the proportion of employees in temporary employment recorded in 2019 was much higher for young people. And the same is the situation concerning part-time employment. It is worth mentioning that in 9 out of the 28 European countries, more than half of the employees aged 15 to 24 worked on a temporary basis before the onset of the pandemic. Part-time workers in the European Union were twice the risk of poverty than those employed full-time. The poverty risk, and you can see it at the figure over there, the poverty risk rates recorded in part-time employment were considerably higher for workers aged 15 to 24 than those for the rest of the age groups. During the previous decade, the risk of poverty in temporary employment increased considerably in the majority of the European countries. The risk for temporary employment was almost 3 times higher for employees with temporary jobs than those with permanent jobs. So there is a clear association between in-work poverty risk, social vulnerability, and precarious work that affects different types of the key determinants of the life course, especially of young people. Now, in the case of Greece, during the previous decade, there was a significant increase in the proportion of young part-time workers, while the share of young temporary employees was much higher than that of the other age groups. Additionally, the gender gap in part-time employment was considerably higher. Greece was the EU member state with the highest youth unemployment rate during that decade. In December 2020, after the onset of the pandemic, the youth unemployment rate stood up to 34.2, namely 1 out of 3 young people in Greece was unemployed. And the total unemployment rate in Greece reached almost 16%, while in the European Union, the average was 7.5%. In the period, in the previous decade, part-time employment rate for workers, for young workers, rose significantly, approaching the EU rate. In 2019, the part-time employment rate in Greece was higher than in 2010 by 8.8 percentage points, while 1 out of 5 young people used to work part-time. So you can see the increase, the rising of all the forms of precarious work. Throughout the period 2019, part-time employment was much more common among women in all the age groups. So there is again a gender dimension in precarious work. During the previous decade, part-time workers with educational attainment corresponding to OECD ISCET level 3 to 4, the ones so-called medium-skilled, had a predominant share. So there is a clear association between the educational capital and the status of employment. In the private sector, over the latest years, since 2014, part-time and rotating employment requirements exceeded by far those of full-time employment. The new contracts increased in terms of precarious work instead of permanent work. During the previous decade, out of all part-time workers, more than half did not change their employment status. About 1 in 4 went into full-time employment, while 1 in 10 became unemployed. During this period, the fluctuation was recorded as regards the risk of poverty rate in part employment from 29.4% in 2010, it rose to a peak of 30.3% in 2016, and then started to fall gradually but slightly. In the last decade, the share of temporary employees, the young ones, was about 3 times higher than the share of the temporary employees among the older age groups. The figure you can see, the figure 5, indicates that throughout the above-mentioned period, both in Greece and in the EU, the share of temporary employed young people was much higher than the share of other 2 groups or age groups. In 2019, the duration of most temporary employment contracts for young people in Greece was from just 4 to 12 months. In that period, more than half of young people aged 15 to 24 chose a temporary job because they couldn't find a permanent one. They had no other option. On average, the percentage of young people in the so-called involuntary temporary employment during the years 2010 to 2019 in Greece was much higher than the EU average. And moreover, over the years 2010 to 2018, temporary workers' risk of poverty was more than double comparing to the permanent ones, the permanent workers. Throughout 2020, the first year of the pandemic, Greece was among the EU countries with the highest rates of the labor market slack, the consequences of which were more severe among young people. Moreover, the impact of the pandemic crisis on the labor market was broad and deep, resulting in increased employment precariousness. In the third quarter of 2020, Greece was the EU member state with the highest unemployment rate in terms of the extended labor force. Greece was among the countries for which the largest gender gap has been identified. And allow me to add that for the young people during the first quarter of 2021, the labor market slack stood up to 55.4%, which was the highest percentage among the EU 27 member states. Greece is one of the countries with the highest percentage of people who lost their jobs either temporarily or permanently during the pandemic, 14%. The total job losses in paid employment in March 2020 amounted to 42,000 positions compared to the immediately previous months. 74% were related to part-time and rotating employment. The repercussions of the pandemic on the labor market were multidimensionally and affected all the sectors of the economy. For both the first and the second quarter of 2020, as regards absences from work and reduced working hours, the sectors more affected were those related to the provision of services and mainly related to tourism, the trade, hotel, restaurants, transport, communications, with agriculture, forestry, and fisheries also affected, but to a lesser extent. According to the General Confederation of Greek Workers, in a survey conducted in September 2020 to examine the insecurity and the growing concern of private sector employees due to the changes that occurred during the pandemic, recorded that more than 7 out of 10 workers believe that the pandemic crisis could endanger core workers' rights. Similarly, the level of employment security had also followed a downturn trend, with just 54% of the employees stating it was quite optimistic about maintaining its position, its current position. In terms of the state of play in 2021 and 2022, allow me just to highlight the issue of needs, young people, not education, employment, and training. The high percentage of young people, and especially in the category A, in the category 25-29, who are essentially away from any major institutional provision of the welfare state and constitute a predominantly socially vulnerable group, is particularly worrying, and at the same time indicative of the evolutionary dislocation of the labor market in Greece, indicating at the same time the effect of the pandemic in it. There was an increase around 10% within a year among the needs, and the percentage of the extended age group 15 to 29 rose up to almost to 20%. After September 21 and the resumption of economic activity in the summer and the successful tourist season, things were improved. However, in December 21, actually the total unemployment decreased in 20.8%. However, it remains at the top 3 of the European Union, according to Eurostat. The reduction of youth unemployment was also significant, mainly due to the seasonal work. More specifically, it increased to 24.5%. It increased slightly in December 2021, reaching 25%. And it still remains very, very high. In September 2022, the youth unemployment is 28.5%, which is a very high rate of youth unemployment. And further, the energy crisis, the ongoing energy crisis all across Europe, is already affecting the labor market in Greece, resulting in a further precarity among workers. And you can see that Greece is the 3rd country with the highest level of people at risk of poverty and social exclusion among the EU member states, rising around 27%, while in terms of socio-ecological poverty indicator in the EU, Greece is at the 2nd place of the highest socio-ecological poverty, while the percentage of in-work poverty is more than 11%. Now, given the qualitative research we conducted, we have several interesting findings, or at least I think interesting findings. Young people seem to be employed mostly in precarious form of employment, either by concluding fixed term or indefinite contracts, full-time or mainly part-time, or by undeclared work, either in business or as self-employed, including undeclared teleworking. It is worth noting that precarious work among young people, it is not only traced in sectors of the economy such as tourism and catering, it is also observed in several occupations: pharmaceutical industry, telecommunications, e-commerce. In e-commerce, we have digital nomads, but we also have social nomads. The main characteristics of precarious employment, especially when they are part of the contracting process, quite often seem to take a combined form. There is a gradually increasing combination of a mismatch between the contract and the actual employment in terms of hours, days, earnings, and stats. Further, a combination of declared and undeclared work is also observed. Why young people choose to work in precarious form of employment or flexible forms of employment resulting in becoming precarious. They don't actually choose. They have no other options. So they turn to these forms of employment for livelihood and survival reason. It's a survival strategy due to the lack of viable alternatives as to the impossibility of finding permanent or full-time employment or a job on the subject of their studies. Many young people seem to accept the precarious working conditions and consequently have accepted or even more almost normalized inappropriate and irregular working conditions, behaviors, and attitudes of both clients and, above all, employers and superiors. And in many cases, this condition state seems to be a forced informal norm and a common secret among employees that many times, out of necessity, employees conceal due to the danger that lurks to be fired from their work, to lose their work. It seems that precarious work in all its forms affects young people's life course, either to a greater or lesser extent. Precarious work functions either as the last resort, given the economic situation of Britain and other countries, and especially the southern countries of Europe, and consequently, the difficulty of finding a job, or less as a temporary professional way out to improve both professional prospects and the quality of standard of living. Family operates as a safety net, as a policy substitute of social policy. So it acts in essence as a deterrent to the further widening of the precariousness of young people and vulnerability, and as a factor in reducing the risk of young people moving into trajectories of full social vulnerability and impoverishment. There seems to be a strong correlation between the precarious work and the burden of young people's psychology, showing high levels of generalized stress and insecurity in their daily lives due to the high risk of dismissal and because of their low financial earnings, which in some cases has led them to despair over their livelihood prospects. With regard to the existing labor legislation and regulatory framework for the protection of workers employed in precarious forms of work, the research findings show the severe implementation gaps regarding the actual implementation of the labor law in combination with the shortcomings observed in relation to the frequency of inspections by the competent bodies for compliance with labor legislation. In many cases, the growing tendency of flexibility of labor relations in the private sector seems to result in either the unilateral abuse by the employers or the forced informal agreement consensus between employers and employees. The above mentioned are framed by established chronic pathogens of the Greek labor market that were expanded during the economic recessions of the previous decade and the financial crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and have led to an evolutionary disengagement of labor relations, especially in the private sector, from the existing regularity framework. What we actually have here is a transformation of the work ethics, which in conclusion, all the above mentioned turn out that a new labor market dualization is formed, a new norm, where young people who are precarious workers can be divided in insiders that can be considered the precarious workers who are employed in a more structured and less flexible working regimes with more normal terms of employment. Outsiders are the young people who are precarious workers and are employed with flexible working conditions and with an increased risk of experience the so-called phenomenon of terror according to Lodovici and Sementa. What about the political behavior and public trust? All of the above reflect on an expanded devaluation of political institutions and consequently a serious major crisis of confidence in conjunction with the ongoing de-escalation of public trust among young people. Actually, public trust among young people, given two large-scale research surveys, we conducted one in 2016-2017, quantitative, and one in 2020, qualitative. They both show that there is actually a collapse of public trust among young people. With regard to the existing labor legislation and regulatory framework for the protection of workers employed in precarious forms of work, the research findings show the severe implementation gaps that I referred before. The following also were found. The intense dissatisfaction, frustration, and distrust they feel for the political system and the political staff in Greece, but also for the institutions, even for the institution of justice. Young people's frustration with the welfare state, the structures and policies implemented. They believe that welfare state doesn't actually work, doesn't actually provide for the social vulnerable groups. And all of the above mentioned reflect an expanded devaluation of political institutions, and subsequently a serious major crisis of confidence in conjunction with the collapse of the public trust in which I referred before. So in order to conclude, there is an emerged work normality in the context of which young people are often forced to consent for livelihood reasons, in parallel with a frequent violation of their labor rights, seems to have formed a newly work ethics and a newly labor discourse framed by regular or informal labor relations and an enforced law of silence among employees and employees, to which the latter quite often consent either for survival reasons or due to a lack of employment alternatives. This new normality affects key determinants of young people's political behavior, and increasing frustration and delegitimization of the political system and personnel, as well as the welfare state, seems to result in the collapse of public trust among youth. These implications in what we call the framework of biography may be decisive and far-reaching for social cohesion, and the need for a paradigm shift in the labor market constitutes a persistent challenge for the whole public policy complex. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.